Hello, my name is Jerry Arnold. I'm the co-chair of the RS Men's group that is sponsoring this event. My other co-chairs are Rick Brom. There's Rick down there. Wave, Rick. There we go. And Tomas Isakowitz. Wave, Tomas. There we go. Anyway, we want to thank you all for coming. Tonight, we have a special event presented by Lucas Isakowitz, affectionately known to us all as the son of Tomas and Patricia Isakowitz. Anyway, tonight's lecture is climate change, what it is, and how we can solve it. And just a brief bio, Lucas, excuse me, is the current Presidential Management Fellow at the federal government, where he works on cross-agency environmental policy initiatives. He has a master's degree from Yale School of Environment, where he studied international climate policy under former Secretary of State John Kerry. He's also worked as a journalist and as a commercial salmon fisherman, and as now he's putting his energy towards finding effective policy solutions that work for both the present and the future. And with that, I'm going to get off the line here and let Lucas take over. Lucas?
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate that intro. That makes me feel like I'm like a full-fledged adult, even though I think most of the people that I see on this call that I recognize make me feel like I'm a little kid, because I have like known all of you for a long time, and you've seen me with doing my bar mitzvah and running around like a little lunatic. So thanks for making me feel like an adult, Jerry. I appreciate it a lot. I think that that's a pretty grandiose intro to what I've been working on. I was lucky enough to go to grad school at Yale and study environmental policy, which really I think gave me a good foothold into sort of what the problems of climate change are, why it's such a difficult problem to solve, and what are some potential solutions. And right now, as Jerry said, I'm working I have a fellowship at the federal government, which allows me to rotate around to different agencies and do environmental policy work. And it's a pretty exciting time to be doing that, especially in the past month, because the new administration is going full blast, not just reversing, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking, bringing politics to the table, but when it comes to climate change, there's no doubt that the previous administration was doing a horrible job, and it was really endangering future generations to be able to thrive on this planet. And the Biden administration has not only reversed most of Trump's climate policies, but they're actually going above and beyond and have taken some pretty significant steps. So it's an exciting time to be working with the federal government. I thought that, well, yeah, I think that the best way to do this is my dad, Tomas Isakowitz, and my mom, Patricia. Hey, how's it going? You guys can unmute yourselves for a second if you want to say hello to me. I haven't seen them in a while. I'm in Wyoming. So I haven't seen them in a bit. So my dad asked me to do this talk. And I think that the best way to do this is to start with a little 10-minute video, which I sent to my dad, and maybe Bapi, you can put it into the chat and everyone can watch it on their own, or we could do a screen share. I'm not sure what the easiest is.
I think the easiest way is, Ned, can you do a screen share with sound? And then we all have it at the same time.
Yeah, so we can watch, I know it's about 10 minutes. We can watch this all together, if that's the plan.
Yeah, yeah, I
Okay.
think that would be great. We can watch this great video by Vox, which sets up the problem, what the problem of climate change is, and why it's so hard for us to, as humans, to sort of think about and tackle, and then sets up some interesting discussion about what potential solutions are. And then I think maybe the best way to move forward after that is my dad had a whole bunch of questions which we wanted to start working through in terms of what climate change is, what the carbon cycle is, what are carbon credits, what are, just like really going down the line in terms of what are some interesting things about climate change that we want to discuss. And also, I'm really happy as we work through those questions and have this conversation, I'm really happy to field questions generally. And I know it's a big group, but I'm really happy to have this be a little bit of a talk from my end, but then just have it be a discussion. So I think that that's the best way to move forward is first the video and then just some questions. And I hope everyone's got some wine or something to loosen the tongue. Yes, cheers. So Ned, oh, awesome. Thank you.
Toward the day when climate change could be irreversible.
Rising sea levels already altering this nation's coast.
China's capital is choking in its worst pollution of the year.
5% of species will become extinct.
Sea levels rising, glaciers melting.
Okay, enough. I get it. It's not like I don't care about polar bears and melting ice caps. I'm a conservation scientist, so of course I care. I've dedicated my entire career to this. But over the years, one thing has really become clear to me. We need to change the way we talk about climate change. This doom and gloom messaging just isn't working. We seem to want to tune it out.
And this fear, this guilt, we know from psychology, is not conducive to engagement. It's rather the opposite. It makes people passive. Because when I feel fearful or guiltful, I will withdraw from the issue and I'll try to think about something else that makes me feel better.
And with a problem this overwhelming, it's pretty easy to just turn away and kick the can down the road. Somebody else can deal with it. So it's no wonder that scientists and policymakers have been struggling with this issue too.
So I like to say that climate change is the policy problem from hell. You almost couldn't design a worse problem as a fit with our underlying psychology or the way our institutions make decisions. Many Americans continue to think of climate change as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space, that this is about polar bears or maybe some developing countries.
Again, it's not like we don't care about these things. It's just such a complicated problem. But the thing is, we've faced enormous, scary climate issues before. Remember the hole in the ozone layer? As insurmountable as that seemed in the 1970s and 80s, we were able to wrap our heads around that and take action.
People got this very simple, easy to understand concrete image of this protective layer around the Earth, kind of like a roof, protecting us, in this case, from ultraviolet light, which, by the way, has the direct health consequence of potentially giving you skin cancer. Okay, so that now you got my attention. And so then they came up with this fabulous term, the ozone hole. Terrible problem, great term.
People also got a concrete image of how we even ended up with this problem. For decades, chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, were the main ingredient in a lot of products, like aerosol spray cans. Then, scientists discovered that CFCs were actually destroying the atmospheric ozone.
People could look at their own hairspray and say, do I want to destroy the planet because of my hairspray? I mean, God, no. And so what's interesting is that sales of hairspray and those kinds of products and underarm aerosols started dropping quite dramatically.
People listened to scientists and took action. Now scientists predict that the hole in the ozone layer will be healed by around 2050. That's actually pretty amazing. And while stopping the use of one product is actually pretty easy, climate change caused by greenhouse gases, that's much, much trickier. Because the sources are more complicated and for the most part, they're totally invisible.
Right now, there is CO2 pouring out of tailpipes, there's CO2 pouring out of buildings, there's CO2 pouring out of smokestacks, but you can't see it. The fundamental cause of this problem is largely invisible to most of us. I mean, if CO2 was black, we would have dealt with this issue a long time ago.
So CO2 touches every part of our lives. Our cars, the places we work, the food we eat. For now, let's just focus on one thing, our energy use. How do we make that visible? That was the initial goal of UCLA's ENGAGE project, one of the nation's largest behavioral experiments in energy conservation.
What we're trying to do is to figure out how to frame information about electricity usage so that people save energy and conserve electricity. The idea is that electricity is relatively invisible to people.
The research team outfitted part of a student housing complex with meters that tracked real-time usage of appliances and then sent them weekly reports. So you can see how much energy the stove used versus the dishwasher or the fridge.
We realized because of this project that the fridge was like the monster.
So lucky for them, their landlord upgraded their fridge to an energy-efficient one. They also learned other energy-saving tips, like unplugging their dishwasher when not in use, and air-drying their clothes during the summer months. And researchers, in turn, discovered where people were willing to cut back. The ENGAGE project wanted to know what types of messaging could motivate people to change their behavior.
We wanted to see over time, over a year, and with repeated messages, how do people behave? How does that impact the consumer behavior? And what we found is that it's very different.
Some households were sent personalized emails with their energy bill about how they could save money. Others learned how their energy use impacted the environment and children's health. Those who received messages about saving money did nothing. It was totally ineffective because electricity is relatively cheap. But emails sent that linked the amount of pollutants produced to rates of childhood asthma and cancer, well, those led to an 8% drop in energy use and 19% in households with kids. Now, in a separate study, researchers brought social competition into the mix. First, they hung posters around the dorm building to publicly showcase how students were really doing. Red dots for energy wasters, green for those doing a good job, and a shiny gold star for those going above and beyond. This social pressure approach led to a 20% reduction in energy use. This strategy was also used at Paulina's complex, and it definitely brought out her competitive streak.
For me, the competition was what motivated me, because seeing your apartment number and telling you that you are doing at the average, but you are not the best, was like, why? I'm doing like everything that you are telling me to do. I always wanted the gold star because it's like, oh my God, I want to be like the less consumption of energy in the whole building.
And psychology studies have actually proved this. We are social creatures, and as individualistic as we can be, turns out we do care about how we compare with others. And yes, we do like to be the best.
Some people don't want to say, oh, I'm like the average. No, my usage is different and I want to be able to act on it.
And people can act on it, because with these meters, they can now see their exact impact. A company called O-Power is playing with this idea of social competition. They work with over 100 utility companies to provide personalized energy reports to millions of customers around the world. Now consumers can not only see their energy use, but how it compares to their neighbors. Like the UCLA study found, this subtle social pressure encourages consumers to save energy. It's been so effective that in 2016, O-Power was able to generate the equivalent of 2 terawatt-hours of electricity savings. That's enough to power every home in Miami for more than a year. And they're not alone. Even large companies are tapping into behavioral science to move the dial. Virgin Atlantic Airways gave a select group of pilots feedback on their fuel use. Over the course of a year, they collectively saved over 6,800 tons of fuel by making some simple changes. adjusting their altitudes, routes, and speed reduced their carbon dioxide emissions by over 21,000 tons. These behavioral nudges do seem to be advancing how we as a society deal with some pretty complicated climate change issues. But it turns out we're just getting started. There is no quick fix.
We need people changing their companies, changing their business models, changing the products and services they provide. This is about broader scale change.
And part of this change includes embracing what makes us human. That it can't just be a guilt trip about dying polar bears or driving around in gas guzzlers. We need to talk about our wins as well. Like how we're making progress, really being aware of our energy use and taking advantage of that competitive spirit we all have in order to really move us from a state of apathy to action. Global warming is by far the biggest issue of our time. Climate Lab is a new series from Vox and the University of California, and we'll be exploring some surprising ways we can tackle this problem. If you want to learn more, head to climate.universityofcalifornia.edu.
Great.
Thanks, Ned, for playing that. I really love this whole series that Vox produced on climate change, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in, they have a bunch of little 10-minute videos that talk about different topics related to climate change, and it's very, very good. I think I like this video a lot because to me it brings up sort of 4 questions or points, which I think facilitates a larger discussion and understanding about climate change. One is, it makes me think about why climate change is such a hard and difficult problem for us to solve, and sort of how long we've been trying to think about climate change and unsuccessfully trying to bring about solutions. 2, it makes me think what sort of messaging would work or doesn't when it comes to trying to motivate action. 3, it makes me think about whether we should be putting the onus on individual behavioral shifts, these nudges that we're talking, that they mentioned in the video, if that's an effective way, or if we should be thinking about top-down solutions. So it's the onus on the individual or policymakers or markets. And then 4, it makes me think, what are the actual incentives? Social pressure versus money, a tax versus a cap and trade system, this sort of stuff. Like, what are the ways that you can actually nudge, whether that's an individual or an entire market, to try to make the necessary changes? So that's why I really like this video. And I think in what I said that there's a lot to unpack. So maybe to start unpacking some of those and getting the conversation going, Poppy, do you want to ask me questions?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to start at like a kind of a basic, very basic level. I mean, I have a general understanding that climate change and global warming are so, but I'd like to know how it's defined and what it actually means, and specifically, is there a difference between global warming and climate change, or are these two things just different ways of trying to coin a name for the same thing?
Okay, so I think we can actually start with going back. When do people think that that Western scientists first identified that climate change was man-made climate change was possible? I'm going to answer what the difference between climate change and global warming is, but when do people think Western scientists were first pinpointed this idea that man was able to alter the climate?
So let me suggest that instead of talking, people put in the chat the number, what year they thought it was. So
1950s. 1950s is a very good answer. That's when the first congressional hearing happened, where an American scientist testified that climate change was going to be a problem. But it was actually about 100 years before that, in the 1800s.
Yeah. Humboldt.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So there were a number of scientists, including John Tyndall. There was also a Swedish chemist named Arrhenius, who were all doing calculations, thinking about how they were trying to figure out why the Earth was as warm as it was. And they sort of figured, okay, well, it doesn't make any sense given the solar radiation that's coming in. The temperature should be way, way colder. So there must be some sort of envelope around the Earth keeping us warm. And then they concluded that if there was an envelope around the Earth that's keeping us warm, altering that envelope might, in fact, change the temperature. And actually, in the 1890s, this Swedish chemist Arrhenius derived that doubling in the atmospheric carbon dioxide would produce a global warming effect of between 2.5 and 4 degrees Celsius. He used a pencil and paper because a calculator hadn't been invented yet, and his estimates are like spot on today. So it's pretty remarkable how long we've known about this potential, this possibility. And I don't know who in the chat put that in the 1950s, that was really when we started to ring alarm bells and say, this is not just a potential possibility, but this is going to happen and it's going to bring some significant consequences. And so that brings me to your question, Tomas, which is climate change versus global warming. Originally, people were throwing out a lot of different terminologies for what this should be called, this issue. And we thought that that increased CO2 levels would make the planet warmer across the board. And so scientists and policymakers threw out different names and decided that global warming was what they landed on. And actually, there's this really great paper where a scientist in the 70s or 80s says, we shouldn't have called it global warming. We should have called it the microwave effect or the deep fryer or something like that, because global warming sounds really good and nice. Who doesn't want to be warm? And so he regrets having coined the term global warming. And why we shifted to climate change recently is because we realized that it's actually not simply just increasing the temperature. It's actually just altering the climate in a lot of different regions. So you'll have some regions that get warmer because of their spot on the planet. Other regions will get colder. Other regions will get drier. Other regions will get wetter. It's essentially just changing the cycle of how climate works around the planet in a way that is not uniform. And the problem is not that it's happening, because it's happened throughout all of the history of the Earth. It's the speed at which it's happening. So it doesn't give time for species, plants, animals to really catch up and be able to maintain their survival. So
let me ask you something related to that. I mean, you just said something about 4 degrees Celsius or 2.4 degrees Celsius. I don't remember which it is, but it doesn't sound like significant to me. You know, it's the difference between nothing. Like, you know, it doesn't even mean I'm going to change the way I'm dressed. So why is that important? And what's the impact of something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's two ways to think about this. One really easy way is having a fever, right? You know, like what's our body temperature? 98 point something degrees. But if you have a fever of 104, you're going to the hospital. And that's a pretty slight change. And it's because of all of these, the body, it needs certain temperatures to be able to continue its functions, which have developed over long periods of time. So if we think of the planet in a similar way, and thank you, 98.6 degrees. If you think of the body as similarly, the planet as a sort of entire organism, which similarly has evolved over millions of years, where there are some species that can move for sure. If you're a migratory bird, maybe you'll switch to have different patterns or, you know, whatever, this and that. There's definitely some species that won't be affected, but think of all the trees and the plants and the things that have that move really slowly. They've evolved over millions and millions of years for that specific climate, which like 1 degree, 2 degrees, it fluctuates, but it creates a cascading effect. And so then you're left with all of these species that can't really move, having to face much harsher environments, which just changes the nature of how they can just continue to do what they've been doing for a very long time. So it might seem like a small change, but it's not. And then there's the whole thing about, like, I used to have nightmares as a kid. My parents know this, about the Arctic melting and stuff. And like the whole thing about sea level rise and increased. So sea level rise is going to happen with a few degrees change in temperature because of melting ice sheets. That's going to be pretty bad as well. So
I think that brings me to
it's an average. The 4 degrees Celsius is an average. So it varies by latitudes quite a bit.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes.
So I think you started touching on this, like, Arctic ice melting and so on. How does it manifest itself currently? I mean, because one of the problems is that you can't see that it's going to happen in the future. So, but are there signs now of the things happening? And, like people saying the Texas freeze, is that like a result of global warming? People want to see now. Is there an effect now?
Yeah. So I think that's also the answer is yes, that there is an effect now. But I think this also is something that they talked about in that video, which is why it's so hard for climate change to garner political attention. When there's a war or a famine or a pandemic, like, we see the bodies piling up immediately. You really have a visceral sense of what's going on. Climate change is much more nefarious because it's slow moving. It is happening now, and we're starting to see the impacts, but it's very hard to like point your finger exactly and say, yes, that was caused by climate change. So when we think of situations like Texas, you can see that, it's not just this cold spell that happened here that destroyed everything. 3 years ago, they had Hurricane Harvey, right? Which dumped, I think, like a year's worth of rain in like 5 days in Houston or something like that. And that wasn't caused explicitly by climate change because you can't point to it. But what it did do is it increased the probability of more intense storms occurring and more volatile weather. And do you want to say something?
Oh.
This is my girlfriend here, who's also studied climate change, is telling me that I'm not saying something correct.
Okay, so hi everyone. So like from sort of a carbon cycling perspective, like one way to think about why you end up with more extreme weather events in that specific instance is that warming, when you have higher temperatures, whether it's like a 0.1 degree or about 1 degree, you have increased warming in the atmosphere, which draws up water vapor from the oceans, which is actually very potent. It's the most prominent greenhouse gas that we have, water vapor. And so, as that's moving around in the atmosphere, and then sort of you end up having more extreme weather events like tornadoes and hurricanes and things like that. So anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, no, but I think that this is the really important point here, is that some of these things are happening and they're extreme weather events, fires in the West, drought, small extinction events are happening now, but you can't point to it exclusively and say climate change caused that. And I think that is really a problem when we think about motivating the public to act.
I think Jerry asked a nice question in the, which I don't know what it means, but you ask about what's the tipping point. So do you want to elaborate on that, or Jerry?
So a lot of the scientists are talking about that if nothing's done, we may reach certain tipping points in some of the weather patterns and conditions on the planet. And I was wondering if you could just sort of explain to folks what is meant by that.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Hold on. If you're gonna talk, move the camera, because you have a light behind you and we can't see
Emily.
Emily, so you guys need to.
Yeah, we want to see you.
Hi. So my background is in permafrost, and I studied soils in undergrad. And part of the aspect of tipping points is that you have to think about sort of the carbon cycle. And I don't know if Lucas touched on this at all, but you have carbon sources and you have carbon sinks, and you have terrestrial, which is like land carbon sinks and sources, as well as oceanic carbon sinks and sources. And so there's this sort of compounding effect as we sort of wither away the ability of these carbon sinks to operate, as they uptake, for instance, in oceans, as they uptake more and more carbon dioxide, they become more and more acidic. And that actually eats away at the ability of the ocean to be a potent carbon sink. And then it ends up turning into a source. Now, thinking about that in terms of permafrost, which is this massive carbon sink that's been frozen for millennia, as we begin to warm that, all of these ancient sort of microbes begin to wake up. And as they wake up, they begin to eat all of that amazing soil organic carbon, and they respire, and that is CO2. So these tipping points are that we are beginning to stress these systems to such an extent that they turn from sinks and into sources. The permafrost, the amount of carbon that's stored in the permafrost is many times what is in the atmosphere. So it becomes this sort of runaway sort of machine, snowball sort of effect.
I think a good way of thinking about it is there's this concept in ecology called alternative stable states, which is that imagine that you're like a cup or a bowl, and there's a ball that's rolling in and out, and it can move from one extreme to the other, but it's still within this range, right? And what's happening with the carbon cycle is that we have a certain amount of carbon that's in the soil, a certain amount of carbon that's in the air, and a lot of it has been stored in these places like permafrost and fossil fuels, and it doesn't really go into the atmosphere, and so the temperature stays within this range. But what's happening once we reach one of these tipping points is the ball is actually going up and over into a different cup that's up here. And so now we've released all of this additional carbon. Once the temperature increases a certain amount, like Emily was saying, the permafrost will start to thaw, which will release more CO2, more dangerous greenhouse gas emissions. And now you're stuck in a totally different cup, which would be fine if it took millions of years to get here. But if it took a few hundred years, the creatures that have evolved over millions of years to adapt to specific environments don't have time to catch up. And so that's sort of the tipping point. And to put an exact number on this, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the leading scientific body when it comes to climate change, is run by the United Nations, says that we need to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. And that means that we need to reduce our emissions by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. And then we need to reach net zero carbon emissions around 2050. Very, very hard goal to achieve.
But not impossible.
But not impossible.
So on that, what can we do? I'm getting bombarded by all this negative messaging, like they say in the movie, and I just want to run away and smoke a joint or something and forget about this.
That's what you should do for sure.
But compel me to do something. Not me, just everybody.
Well, so I think that this is actually really important because there is a philosophical and policy debate about whether the onus should be on the individual to act or whether it should be a top-down regulatory or market-driven sort of change. And so I think that it has to be both. I think probably the most effective thing that everyone here can do is go and vote for local, state, and federal officials that are prioritizing climate change. And that's what happened in this election, and that's why we're seeing a seismic shift here. That's probably the most important thing. Sorry, but we could also talk about some specific practices to reduce your own carbon footprint, if that's of interest to people, or we can talk about more like regulatory frameworks and carbon sequestration and I don't know, whatever. Where do we want to go? Oh, you've muted yourself.
Me? Do you want to say? Let's talk about the what can the, briefly, what can the individual do?
I think there were some points brought up in the chat, so maybe some discussion of that would be helpful too.
Sure, okay.
So what practical tips could you
So
walk?
what do you say to folks who point out that the climate has changed over eons of the Earth's history? So Marsha Weinreb said, so climate has changed, right? Through the history. Why is this different?
I don't know if it's been touched on before, but this is sort of a reasonable and common sort of response, I think, to why should we sort of address climate change with such urgency. It's really the pace and at which it's occurring. So historically, when the planet has undergone climate change, it's occurred over many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millennia of years. The amount of carbon that we've put into the atmosphere has really occurred within the bulk of it has occurred within the last 30 years. So, these processes are occurring at a much faster rate because we're actually converting the landscape at a much faster rate. Cities are sort of popping up overnight. Population is booming.
Yeah, exactly. The last time that the planet had this much CO2, there weren't in the atmosphere, there weren't humans walking around, and there wasn't all this coastal development and infrastructure set up. And so it's true, 65 million years ago, an asteroid came and sorry, I'm laughing. I'm thinking the Earth, sorry, I'm going to make a Jewish joke, but I'm going to skip it. 65 million years ago, dinosaurs became extinct because an asteroid came, smashed into the Gulf of Mexico, and it destroyed 95% of life on Earth. And it's true, like that was a natural event, and that occurred. 10 million years later, it took 10 million years for the diversity of life to come back to that same level. And so when we think of, okay, like these sort of events do happen, it's true. And that sometimes they happen very quickly. In the case of the dinosaurs, it did, but it has catastrophic results. So if we want to keep things alive, then we should avoid it.
And I also think that there's a point to be made for resilience. I think we've made the planet less resilient due to habitat fragmentation and land use conversion. And so there's less ability for sort of wildlife and biodiversity in general to sort of move with the changing climate as they historically have.
Great, thank you. So why don't we put some questions in the chat so I don't monopolize the discussion. I think Randy said, in terms of practical tips, could you walk through a typical day and note some steps everybody can take to, I guess, use less energy or to contribute to lessen global warming or climate change?
Do you want to touch on that one then too?
Sure. And then Susan Freidenberg asks, at one point, do you see all cars being electric? At what point? So if you look at the emissions patterns in the United States, the big things are transportation, power,
cement curing.
Cement curing
Which
is
is
big.
kind of funny.
Definitely food, and then the things that we consume, the products that we buy. And so if we think about our own footprint in terms of those four categories, food, transportation, power, and consumption, you can start tackling those things, and you can shop responsibly. There's some brands that are trying to reduce their own carbon footprint by advocating for being net carbon neutral or zero emissions. You can ride your bicycle, or you can sort of carpool or take public transportation. And when you fly, you can choose to offset your flight, which we can talk about what offsetting is if that's interesting to people. It's a little bit controversial, but I am kind of an advocate, and I don't know where you lie on this, Emily, but I actually don't really think that climate change is going to be solved by individuals buying less water bottles and walking to work, because we have 7.5 billion people on the planet. Most of them live in poverty, and they are rapidly developing their economies in Asia, in Africa, in South America. They're trying to get to where we are in terms of the quality of life. And the cheapest and fastest way of doing that is by building more coal power plants. And they don't have the luxury of thinking about their emissions. And it's hard for us in the West to criticize them and say, well, don't do that, because we have the luxury of what we're doing. And so if you look at it in terms of that way, that's the train that is coming to smash into us right now. And I think while it might feel good for us to, and I try to do this, is to like consume less in our own lives, I think that we really need to think about, okay, how do we create a global system where the 3.5 billion people that currently don't have power and electricity and all of these Western luxuries are going to have them pretty soon. And if they have them the same way that we do, we're fucked. So that's what I think. Do you think that personal action can solve climate change?
No, but I do think, you know, that doesn't change your personal agency. I do think there is a level of personal responsibility, and while voting is incredibly important, I do think whatever we can do as individuals to decrease our consumption, sort of against this sort of rising wave of consumption that is rising, you know, in sort of emerging economies and countries, the better we can, the more gentler we can be on the planet. Yeah, and I do think a lot of us know the ways, you know. It's like Lucas said, you know, try and get rid of single-use plastics. Think about, you know, the things that you're buying, whether that be household cleaners, you know, sort of how harsh chemicals are, that everything that you purchase ends up somewhere the moment it leaves your house. And so even when it comes down to textiles and the clothes you buy, I mean, they're incredibly resource intensive and require tons of water. So just thinking about ways that you can reduce, reuse, and recycle within your own lives, and advocate for that within your own communities is great. I mean, order a composting service to come and pick up your compost. I pay for one that is like $20 a month, and they come twice a month. And it's, you know, even little things I think can add up to big change. So.
Well, probably also doing little things raises the level of awareness you have, and then you can transmit it to other people. There's a question that came up, and I think it's really related to what you were discussing in terms of, you know, if the individual can't do it all by just changing our behavior, you know, policy could. So there's a question about the Paris Accords, and I had the same question. So, you know, what are the Paris Accords? You know, why they're important? Why was Trump against them? So I think that seems to be of interest. Is that of interest to you? Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, and it was the first time that the entire world, nearly, I think, except for North Korea and maybe Syria, signed on to an international climate agreement. And this had been years and years in the making, decades in the making. And the mechanisms of the Paris Agreement were that it was going to be a totally non-binding international agreement, that meaning that it really had no teeth, but it did have this element of social pressure. which is important thinking back to the video of sort of, did you get the gold star for reducing your electricity use or not? The Paris Agreement had this component where countries would voluntarily put forward their own NDCs, nationally determined contributions, which would say, okay, the United States is going to reduce its emissions by, and I can't remember what we pledged, but by X amount by 2030. And there was kind of like this jockeying among countries where they tried to say, okay, who can do it best? And actually, before the Paris Agreement was signed, Obama met with Xi Jinping maybe 6 months before the negotiations happened in Paris, and China and the US put out a joint release together saying, the US is doing this and China's doing this, which was really powerful in terms of setting a global precedent of being like, oh, okay, like these are the two largest emitters and they're taking this seriously. Why did Trump back out? Because he's an asshole. Sorry, because he's playing politics and he knows that climate change has been this politicized thing for such a long time, and he thought he could garner more and more attention and more support. But the reality is the Paris Agreement was totally non-binding. And so the US could have stayed in the agreement, totally scrapped its nationally determined contribution, not done anything, and yet still had a seat at the table for these negotiations. There was no issue doing that. And Trump blatantly lied and said the Paris Agreement is a bad deal for the US. The Paris Agreement was non-binding. It was no deal for the US. And so now that that Biden is back and Kerry's back, John Kerry's back leading the international climate work that the US is doing, we're totally dovetailing back into the Paris Agreement.
I think Jerry already pointed it out, but yeah, the promise to reduce emissions by 25% by 2025 compared with 2005 levels. And then I saw there's two sort of questions I wanted to touch on. I don't know if everyone's so curious about the electric car. I mean, that would be sort of a brief thing, but honestly, based on the news, I think John Kerry is an excellent choice.
Yeah, we can talk about John Kerry in a second, but you can keep talking about electric cars.
I think based on the news, I honestly, just seeing the trends and the current commitments from different car companies, corporations, it seems to me that we're on track to sort of be fully electric if with things sort of stay as they are by 2030, 2025. What do you think?
Yeah, I think
but sorry, my big but. I do not think that that is a silver bullet. I think electric vehicles, while they do not emit greenhouse gases, is not going to solve our climate issue because they require very intensive mining in lithium, which is a very dirty and sort of humanitarianly controversial practice in a lot of countries. So we have to think about how we are going to source, the rare earth minerals that we're going to need to continue building these vehicles, which will still require fossil fuels by and large.
Totally.
And road building and all the things that come along with, sort of vehicleizing the world.
Yeah.
And then there is another question here. How do we know that sorry, do you want to jump in?
No,
sorry,
go for it.
This is fun. How do we know that the current climate change phenomenon is different from the other relatively recent climate change events, such as the Little Ice Age from the 15th to the 19th century? So we actually have really great records with paleoclimatology depending on ice cores, which actually give us really pristine and accurate sort of models for what past climate was like. And so it's well modeled through a lot of different sort of groups, institutional groups and scientists and academics. And that's sort of what we're measuring current climate phenomena against.
Yeah, and there's a great, here, maybe I can screen share. There's a hockey stick graph, thank you.
The Charles Keeling curve, or?
Yeah, that just shows how all of these different, it's not just it's not just temperature, it's not just CO2, it's not just these other greenhouse gases. There's all of these things that have spiked since the Industrial Revolution. And I actually don't know how to do a screen share, but I encourage everyone to look at
you can post the
at a
link to
hockey.
one of the images.
Just Google hockey stick graph.
There's a share screen button. Yeah.
You have one pulled up that you want to use?
We can just use this one here. How do I do a screen share?
You might need to make him a co-host so he can screen share Ned.
No.
You see that?
Yes, we see.
Yeah, and so this is just modeling the global temperature for the past 1,000 years, and you can really see that it spikes right around the 1850s, which is when the Industrial Revolution started happening. And so, like, as we were saying, I think that there have been temperature changes throughout and climate changes throughout geologic history, but the speed and scale is pretty.
Sorry to interrupt, Lucas. I was just going to mention the blue areas that you see, those are error bands, measurement error bands. And you notice that as the hockey stick starts to go up, the air bands start getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's getting more and more accurate over time. So this question about change is becoming more supported with the data. Or put it another way, those people that don't believe it's happening, it's becoming less and less feasible to argue that, given what we see in not only the trend, which is the dark lines, but the air bands get smaller. The measurements are getting more and more accurate. Sorry to interrupt.
No, please. Everyone should feel free to interrupt.
So there's a question about the Biden administration. Is it looking to budge corporations to do something or make strong policy moves to make needed changes? So what do you think about that?
Is the Biden administration looking to nudge corporations and make strong policy moves to make needed changes? So I think that there's a number of ways to think about answering this question. And if someone knows the exact answer of something that I'm talking about, please jump in. They were talking about like electric cars, I think, or emissions from vehicles is one way to think about this. Under the Obama administration, there was a policy that tried to, and I'm forgetting the specifics, but essentially increased the mandatory fuel efficiency for a lot of vehicles. And it had a target by 2025 or 2030, the CAFE standards. Don't know what CAFE stands for. And then that was rolled back under the under the Trump administration. And so those standards are now coming back in. And so this is definitely a clear signal to car manufacturers saying, okay, well, if you want to continue selling vehicles in the United States, you're going to need to make your vehicles more fuel efficient, which is one policy shift to nudge or force corporations. I think another thing that is probably coming down the pipeline, and this one's going to be harder, but in the United States, we don't have any federal climate policy. Like, we don't have anything nationally that says, okay, carbon dioxide or methane are greenhouse gases and they should be treated as a pollutant and we need to do something about it. Like, that just doesn't exist in the US. The closest thing we had was the Clean Power Plan, which was an executive order under the Obama administration. And so if the Biden administration is able to pass a national national carbon tax or a cap and trade or something essentially that labels CO2 and other greenhouse gases as a pollutant and charges or regulates them effectively, I mean, that's more than nudging. That's strong arming businesses, corporations, manufacturers, whoever, to start taking climate seriously. So
that's what I was asking, actually, to speak, Alan. We had the Clean Air Act. We had the Clean Water Act, dating from 70s and the Nixon administration.
Yeah.
Are we going to get there again? I mean, they've been emasculated, not just by the most recent administration, but
yeah. Are we going to get?
That's the strong policy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard.
Yeah.
But I think that we will get something. I mean, right? Who knows what's going to happen? We have both the Democrats have both houses. And so you can imagine passing some sort of federal climate legislation.
I mean, I think ultimately, though, you bring up a very strong point, because a lot of the most sort of heavy hitting with great teeth environmental policy that's ever been passed has been under Republican administrations. And really, this is an issue that needs to be bipartisan. So how do we change the minds of one party to, work with us instead of against us? And I don't know, a lot of psychology there. that's beyond my scope. But I do think, there are strong movements. A movement that I think will hopefully gain steam is this spiritual ecology movement, and awakening a large segment of different religious populations to the importance of stewarding the land, and really garnering and sort of building that coalition of sort of faith-based environmental work. I really think there's a lot of power there.
Sorry,
I'm sorry to interrupt. We are scheduled to go until 9 o'clock. However, if the group is interested, we could perhaps go to 9:30 or something, if that's people.
How about 10 more minutes?
Yeah, sure.
That's whatever folks want to do.
So let me ask you something. Because did you just say religious ecology? Did I hear that?
Spiritual ecology, yeah.
Spiritual ecology, okay. Which brings me to the fact that, we are a Jewish organization, right?
Yeah.
So are there any Jewish religious values that correspond to Tikkun Olam? I mean, or
So, okay, this is definitely an area that's been a while since I've touched on, but I took a class that a long time ago on the sort of analyzing the Old Testament for environmental stewardship interpretations. And there's a lot within the Old Testament that advocates for, I keep using this word, but good stewardship of the land. And I wish I had come prepared, because I could have pulled those notes and a lot of those highlights. But I think there's a lot of language that provides a strong imperative for faith-based action.
Yeah, there's a growing movement called religion and ecology, or spiritual ecology. And if anyone is interested in this, there's a woman named Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, and they've been writing about this and trying to essentially coalition build within the religious space and the environmental space and make them one. And it's not just Judaism, it's we are the chosen people, but there are other people that are also doing good things. And one of the prime examples of the power of religion and ecology comes from the Pope's encyclical, which he put out maybe 3 or 5 years ago, where he called on the Catholics of the world to think of climate change as a moral imperative. And it had quite a significant impact. And so I think that there are many, many ties between the Jewish tradition and good stewardship.
Nice.
Yes.
So Andrew Kleeman had a good question. He was asking, why do you guys live in a log cabin?
Yeah. So he says, Lucas has a girlfriend. Wonderful. She is so smart, like him. That's true. She's very smart and she's very pretty. We live in Wyoming, in Wilson, Wyoming, close to Jackson Hole. And the other question there is, can they make a living with this climate stuff? And I don't know how serious that question is, but the answer is absolutely. Like, fortunately or unfortunately, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of environmental consulting, climate policy, this sort of stuff. And so the answer is yes, we can make a living. Maybe not make the most amount of money.
Great. Any last questions? Please put them in the chat so we can.
Yeah.
Hear me?
Or if anyone has a burning question that they'd like to.
Well, I do have a burning question. You know, CO2, I mean, when you say CO2, I'm thinking of soda stream, right? So I put my soda stream there, I put it down. I mean, what's it with CO2? Why does CO2 do this?
Why does CO2 warm the planet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very nerdy question. I'm sorry. But
yeah. No, that's okay. It's actually a good question. So I think that there's two components that are important to understand there. One is the carbon cycle, right? That there's a set amount of carbon on the planet and it's stored in different forms, whether that's in the soil or as fossil fuels or in the atmosphere. And as you release a lot more CO2, you're changing the what form it's in. So we've released a lot more CO2. It's gone from a solid form in fossil fuels or in the soil and the trees and gone up into the atmosphere. And then why it causes warming, and again, if someone knows the exact terminology here, please step in, is because it allows certain amount of solar energy and heat wave, whatever stuff in, and then it can't get out. And it like gets reflected back on the earth, and there's like it normally would get reflected back from the Earth's surface and shoot back into space, but it gets trapped. And I think it like comes in as short wave and then leaves as long wave, and the long wave gets trapped by the atmosphere. But if someone knows a specific, feel free to just get in there.
So look, it's 9:04, and I just want to thank you in behalf of RS, and this is it was a Men of RS sponsored activity, and we're very happy to bring this to the whole community, and not just because you are my son and Emily is your girlfriend, but this was a very interesting discussion. I can see it in the chat, in the comments that were made. There's one thing that I think might be a nice way to wrap this up. And then people can stay if they want, or if you want to go. But I don't know who it is, but this is a phone number. It says, give us 5 takeaways to start doing daily in our own way to waiting to hear from legislative. What does it say? Give us 5 takeaways to start doing daily in our own way prior to waiting to hear from Washington. Yeah. Oh, is that Robert Strauss?
Yeah, he can't talk.
Oh, okay.
Why don't we go, we can go until, let's say, to 9:15 or so. But before people start to leave, I neglected to thank Ned Hanover, who is our technical expert tonight, who's been doing a great job. Thank you, Ned. And anyway, we'll go until 9:15, and then we'll call it quits, okay?
Sounds good.
Do you want to unmute Robert Strauss, 796, the phone number? I cannot unmute.
Himself.
You can unmute himself. No, he can't. He doesn't unmute himself. Okay. I think he's asking what can we do before. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So excellent talk, Lucas. I'm an admirer of your parents, and I guess this was a great way of meeting you too. You taught us a lot. Let me ask you, I get very frustrated because I try to do my own little thing every day, recycle. I use so many, the same plastic bag day after day. I wash, let it dry, use it again, and I recycle everything. And I've heard that when you recycle, most of it ends up in the garbage anyway. So just give us 5 tips so that we can do them ourselves and teach them to the non-believers, which there are many, that will have some impact before we hear from Washington, because this is going to take a while? What are little things we can do on an everyday basis so that we all just do it without thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. What are the little things that we can do? I think maybe this isn't maybe such a little thing, but if you have the means and if your property is in the right place, I think transitioning to solar and putting solar panels on your roof. And Philadelphia a few years ago had a great grants program that they allowed you to do that. And that's like huge. And it takes upfront capital, but then, you know, eventually it pays itself off. So if you have the means of doing that, I think that that's pretty powerful. There's studies that show, and I don't know if I really advocate this, again, because I'm not really a believer in personal behavior being the driver here, but if we're looking at it specifically in that way, I think reducing the quantity of red meat that you consume has been shown to be one of the largest individual actions that you can take to reduce your own footprint. And that's because the methane that cows burp and fart out is a really dangerous greenhouse gas. It has a warming factor, I think 100 times more than CO2. And this isn't, you don't need to cut meat out entirely because that's a pretty big shift, but you know, you eat meat once or twice a week, you've significantly cut your carbon footprint. There's also, if you go on some websites like the Nature Conservancy or Conservation International, there's ways that you can calculate your own carbon footprint, where it will ask you a series of questions, sort of like where you live, where you go to work, what you do, what you buy, and it will actually also like give you your carbon footprint. And you can do two things there. It'll inform you as to how you can reduce it, what sort of habits you can do. So if you're interested in these daily tasks, you can sort of go and do that. And the second thing is, most of the time it'll give you the option to purchase carbon offsets for your own emissions. And so that's another option. You can say, okay, well, I'm not going to change my habit, but I am going to purchase carbon offsets. So I know that that's only 3, but I think that those are good 3. I think you've muted yourself again.
Andrew asked a question here. If we are the number,
can you read it?
Andrew, can you unmute yourself and just talk us through it?
Oh, I'm out in root jail. Excellent. Yeah, I think that the most impactful thing that we can do is to work towards building a consensus in America that this is real and urgent. And I think that's far more important than recycling, not to belittle recycling, but a third of our nation thinks this is nonsense. That's really scary. So I have no idea what the solution is, but I think as individuals and as citizens, the most impactful thing we can do is work towards building America back into a leadership role. Thoughts?
I think that's 100% right, Andrew. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, and I think that goes with voting, but also like talking to people and talking to folks that might not think that it's a really important issue, and using all these different sort of messaging tactics and strategies to try to convince folks. Al Gore has been running his foundation for 2 decades now, where he trains average citizens to learn how to speak on climate change, to give presentations and advocate for the environment to groups that might not be willing to, or might not already be aware of the issue. And so there's ample ways to train yourself to be an advocate to help change other people's minds.
Great. So I think with that, we can put it quits. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ned. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Emily. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you to all the people that helped put this together. Thank you, parents, for having me and get educated.
Be together.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Send them to my dad. He'll send them to me.
Thanks again, Nad.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Great presentation.
Adios.
Very good.
Bye.
Good night.
Night.